The individual, known historically as Heinrich Müller, entered the world on April 28, 1900, within the urban center of Munich, situated in the region of Bavaria in southern Germany. His parents were of humble Catholic Bavarian origin, with his father employed as a rural law enforcement official. Subsequently, Müller was enrolled in a state-operated Volksschule, where he received a basic elementary education before commencing an apprenticeship as a mechanic, barely into his teenage years. Beyond these details, information regarding his early life remains scarce, and Müller remained a figure whose personal matters largely eluded scrutiny throughout his existence. Müller's teenage years coincided with a period of considerable upheaval in European history. The continent had been progressively moving towards open conflict amongst its major powers for numerous years. Two military alliances comprising Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy on one side, and Britain, France, and Russia on the other, had taken shape. These alliances were fueled by rivalries, naval dominance between Britain and Germany, Balkan supremacy between Austria, Hungary, and Russia, and colonial possessions in Africa among all powers. Then in the summer of 1914, a localized diplomatic crisis in the Balkans, sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist, swiftly escalated into a comprehensive European confrontation. In just a few days during late July and early August, the major powers declared war upon each other, with the conflict soon encompassing nations beyond Europe, including Japan and the United States. The ensuing conflict, recognized as the First World War, would persist for over 4 years. The Central Powers were spearheaded by Germany, and the most intense combat unfolded in the trenches of northern France on the Western Front, ultimately concluding with the defeat of Germany and its allies and victory for Britain and France in particular. Despite his very young age, just 14, when the war erupted in 1914, Müller engaged in active military service before the conflict concluded in November 1918. His mechanical training led him to specialize in aircraft maintenance, a developing domain at a time when even the most rudimentary forms of air travel were barely a decade old. His service was viewed favorably, and by the war's end, he was awarded the Iron Cross for valor and the Bavarian Military Merit Cross for his service. Consequently, he departed the military in 1918 with honors, standing out somewhat among future senior figures of the Nazi regime for not harboring a lifelong resentment about the war's outcome. Like numerous other former soldiers in Germany during the late 1910s and 1920s, Müller found himself gravitating towards the Freikorps in the war's aftermath. The Weimar Republic, established to govern the nation following the collapse of the German Empire, had been instructed, under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war, to demilitarize and decommission the vast majority of its armed forces. Thousands of soldiers then enrolled in the Freikorps, or Free Corps, a German paramilitary organization of military volunteers that had existed in Prussia and subsequently Germany since the 18th century. In the immediate post-war period, the new republic was plagued by communist unrest as the German Communist movement, emboldened by the achievements of their counterparts in Russia since 1917, sought to seize power in the very country that Karl Marx had originally envisioned for his communist utopia. The Freikorps were deployed extensively nationwide in 1919 and 1920 to suppress this communist agitation. Müller was active within their ranks and participated in active duty with the Freikorps in suppressing the short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic, which had established itself in power in Munich in April 1919. Müller's involvement with the Freikorps and his familial background in law enforcement, his father being a police official in Bavaria, directed him towards the same profession in the early 1920s. He progressed rapidly and was soon elevated to a senior position within the political division of the Munich Police Department. It was through his engagement in Munich's policing that he would initially encounter Adolf Hitler in the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. Ironically, considering his later role in the Nazi regime that would govern Germany, his initial interactions with them were as an adversary. The Nazi Party had originated in 1920 from the German Workers' Party. It had materialized as a political entity for right-wing German nationalists who advocated for a form of workers' revolution based on opposing communism. Its membership largely consisted of war veterans deeply disillusioned by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, negotiated by the Weimar Republic, which they perceived as a blemish on German honor. The party attracted support from veterans in Munich during the early 1920s, and under its leader, the Austrian Adolf Hitler, it quickly grew to encompass tens of thousands of active members and unspoken sympathizers throughout Bavaria. Müller would have been keenly aware of this subversive group's expansion within Munich during the early 1920s due to his police responsibilities, but this casual interaction intensified considerably in the early winter of 1923. On November 8th of that year, approximately 2,000 armed Nazis attempted a coup d'etat in Munich, aiming to seize control of Bavaria and subsequently march on Berlin to overthrow the Weimar Republic. However, the Munich Putsch, or Beer Hall Putsch, as it became known, was a complete failure from a military standpoint. On the morning of November 9th, it was swiftly quelled by German army detachments deployed in Munich. Müller was among the Munich police officers involved in investigating those responsible in the weeks that followed. Admittedly, Hitler and several other senior commanders required little investigation, and after a brief manhunt, he was apprehended in the Bavarian countryside a few days later. Yet his trial afforded him an opportunity to disseminate his viewpoints to the German public, and he would only serve 9 months of a 5-year prison sentence. Ultimately, the most remarkable aspect of the Munich Putsch is that the Weimar Republic failed to capitalize on the event to crush the Nazis when they had the chance. For Müller, his participation in the police investigations following the Munich Revolt of 1923 ensured that in the 1930s, he faced years of mistrust from many senior Nazis. Subsequent to this, his activities in the mid to late 1920s and into the early 1930s are again rather unremarkable. He continued his work as a police officer in Munich, an activity that was in itself somewhat significant in the long run, as Müller was studying the methods employed by Soviet-Russian police organizations, notably the OGPU, or Joint State Political Directorate. This was the main secret police entity within the Soviet Union between 1923 and 1934, and the precursor to the NKVD and the KGB. Through this study, Müller became knowledgeable about the most recent surveillance techniques available to secret police agencies in Europe and acquainted himself with how totalitarian states could monitor vast populations to maintain power and suppress political dissent. These were methodologies he would later utilize himself in his capacity as head of Germany's own secret police, the Gestapo. In the interim, during the 1920s and early 1930s, he was employing such methods to better surveil communist organizations in Bavaria. Müller appears to have cultivated a notable aversion to communists, or what were increasingly termed Bolsheviks in Germany after the Russian Communist Party. This antipathy would heavily influence much of his work with the Nazis later. Although Müller spent much of the late 1920s and early 1930s in relative obscurity, extensive changes were occurring in the broader nation. Following nearly a decade of rapid economic growth after the First World War, the global economy had overheated and dramatically collapsed in 1929 in the event known as the Wall Street crash. Particularly the Nazi Party, which Müller had encountered back in Bavaria in 1923, exploited German resentments about the post-war settlement in this new climate of economic upheaval. They rapidly gained widespread support throughout the nation, and by 1932, this translated into nearly 40% of the vote in the Reichstag elections held that year. This declined to under 35% in early 1933, but an agreement with German industry leaders enabled Hitler to become chancellor at that time. Within weeks, the Nazis leveraged their new position to begin outlawing all other parties and establishing a one-party totalitarian state. In this manner, the Nazis seized power in Germany in 1933. As such, the BVP minister-president of Bavaria, Heinrich Müller, wielded considerable regional authority in Munich in 1933, but he was swiftly challenged by the Nazis in February and March. Müller committed his second transgression against the Nazis at this time by proposing to Held that he militarily resist the Nazis' attempts to overthrow the BVP. Held, however, declined and resigned from office. The authority of the minister-president of Bavaria was subsequently removed, and Bavaria's regional autonomy was completely subordinated to Berlin. Thus, by mid-1933, Müller found himself in a vulnerable position. He had twice, once in 1923 and again in 1933, placed himself in a compromising situation relative to the Nazi Party, which had now assumed total control of Germany. He might have anticipated being removed from his senior position within the Munich Police Department and blacklisted as an opponent of the regime, but he was to be rescued by an unexpected benefactor. Despite his compromising role in the Munich Putsch, Müller had attracted the attention of Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Sicherheitsdienst, the Nazi Security Service, or SD for short, established in 1931. In 1933, the SD and the SS, led by Heinrich Müller, began taking over the police services of the former Weimar Republic and Nazifying them. They commenced in Munich, where Heydrich became aware of Müller's proficiency in advanced surveillance methods. Determining his potential utility, the head of the SD decided to take Müller under his wing rather than purging him from the Munich police. Indeed, Müller was rapidly promoted, becoming a senior inspector by the close of 1933. Müller, for his part, was willing to adapt to the new circumstances, being a man characterized as exceptionally adaptable in his beliefs and primarily driven by career advancement. Müller's subsequent career in the 1930s and beyond became intimately linked to both Heydrich and the Gestapo. The Gestapo, or Geheime Staatspolizei, meaning the secret state police, was created in April 1933 by Hermann Göring. Initially, it was restricted to Prussia, the largest federal constituent state of Germany, encompassing much of the north and northeast of the country. However, its remit and operational areas quickly expanded. On April 20, 1934, Göring transferred control of the Gestapo to the head of the SS, Heinrich Müller. 2 days later, Himmler appointed Heydrich as head of the secret police, and its remit broadened to cover the entire nation. Under Heydrich's leadership, the Gestapo evolved into a specialized police service, frequently staffed by academically accomplished investigators rather than ordinary police officers. Müller was swiftly integrated into the organization, and by 1936 he had ascended to the role of operations chief within the Gestapo, effectively becoming Heydrich's second-in-command. However, this promotion presented a paradoxical aspect. Despite having joined the SS in 1934, Müller did not become a member of the Nazi Party. In fact, a formal assessment of him from the mid-1930s, authored by a Nazi official, highlighted his questionable relationship with the party in previous times. Notwithstanding these complexities, his upward trajectory in the hierarchy persisted in the subsequent years. Müller's responsibilities within the Gestapo encompassed numerous facets of German life under Nazi rule. Initially, the secret police were particularly active in suppressing political opposition to the Nazi regime. This effort primarily concentrated on German communism and labor unions. Müller's extensive experience in prosecuting communists in Bavaria during the 1920s and early 1930s rendered him exceptionally valuable to the Gestapo during this period. Throughout the mid-1930s, the Gestapo subjected former labor union officials to surveillance and frequently arrest, the unions themselves having been largely dismantled in 1933. These endeavors culminated during Müller's early tenure at the Gestapo with the dismantling of the Markowitz Circle. This was a collective of moderate socialists who had established connections with former members of the Nazi Party who had been ousted by Hitler in the 1920s. Much of the Gestapo's methodology at this juncture centered on the policy of protective custody. This involved detaining individuals suspected of disloyal political affiliations and dispatching them to the concentration camps that were proliferating across the nation. Here they were held indefinitely for extended durations without formal charges being brought against them. Bishops and other high-ranking figures within the Roman Catholic Church were subject to particularly close Gestapo observation, notably because their political loyalties extended beyond Germany itself to the Vatican and Rome. Additional groupings that Müller was tasked with monitoring included segments of the media that had managed to retain some autonomy from the increasingly dominant state-controlled media, directed by the Minister for Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, Joseph Goebbels. Lastly, the Gestapo also oversaw the monitoring of individuals' private lives and any conduct deemed objectionable by the Nazis. For example, in 1934, around the time of Müller's recruitment into the Gestapo by Heydrich, a specialized office was established to identify and monitor homosexual men and women in Germany. In the years that followed, thousands of homosexual men and some lesbian women were identified and apprehended, often being sent to concentration camps where many perished or were condemned to forced labor. Müller's character was well suited to tasks of this kind. Not only had he acquired advanced skills in surveillance and other secret police techniques in Munich during the 1920s and early 1930s, but he also possessed a natural inclination toward the responsibilities he was assigned in the 1930s. Müller was a dedicated worker noted by several other senior Nazis as consistently available to answer their calls at any hour of the day or night, 7 days a week. This dedication may have been partly motivated by his domestic life. In 1924, he married Sophie Dischner, the daughter of a Bavarian newspaperman. They had 2 children, a son, Reinhard, born in January 1927, and a daughter, Elizabeth, born nearly 10 years later in September 1936. Elizabeth was born with a physical disability, the precise nature of which remains unclear. Following her birth, Müller's family life became highly strained, and his contemporaries in the Gestapo and other security offices uniformly observed that Müller's marriage was unhappy and that he was never seen in public with his wife and children. Moreover, multiple individuals testified after the war that Müller was perpetually in the office, seemingly only returning home to sleep. In addition to being a workaholic who seemed to want to avoid his home, Müller was intensely ambitious and motivated to advance his career. This ambition seems to have been his primary, perhaps even sole, driving force or motivation. Furthermore, his political convictions were otherwise completely adaptable, and it is remarkably difficult to determine his actual views on any matter, beyond how it might benefit him and how he could accumulate further power and influence within the Nazi regime through it. In reality, his only truly discernible personal opinions during his time at the Gestapo did not involve any attachment to Nazism, but rather his deep-seated hatred for communism. This trait emerged during the formative period of his life in the late 1910s and early 1920s, while working with the Freikorps and subsequently the police service in Bavaria. Above all, he was a meticulous administrator, the kind of unimaginative bureaucrat capable of operating within a realm of surveillance, torture, and persecution if he perceived it as imposing a sense of order and regulation on the society. Contemporaries were impressed by his capacity to spend hours or even days methodically interrogating suspects until a weakness in their defense might surface. Müller became enmeshed in a power struggle within Germany in 1938, which had significant ramifications for the direction of the country's foreign policy. The Nazis were resolute in their aim to dismantle each provision of the Treaty of Versailles and rebuild the German military, the Wehrmacht, to a level where war could be initiated. Their goal was to construct a greater Germany, encompassing much of Central Europe, as an initial step towards conquering Eastern Europe to secure Lebensraum, or living space, in the future. However, despite Hitler and the Nazis' control of the state apparatus, the Wehrmacht retained a considerable degree of autonomy. Many of the generals who considered themselves successors to the old Prussian military tradition rather than Nazi commanders held substantially different political perspectives from Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, Göring, and other senior Nazi leaders. Several of these generals opposed the rapid remilitarization of the country and the plans for an inevitable war with Britain, France, and Russia. Prominent among these dissenting commanders were the War Minister, General Werner von Blomberg, who was critical of Hitler's plans to instigate a European war no later than 1942, and the Commander-in-Chief of the German Armed Forces, Thomas Werner von Fritsch. Müller became pivotal in their removal. The events that became known as the Blomberg-Fritsch affair commenced in the early days of 1938, when it was discovered that Erna Grun, the woman von Blomberg had recently married, had posed for pornographic photographs years prior and was suspected of having been a prostitute. This was based on a report compiled within the Gestapo offices, which actually pertained to a cavalry commander named Achim von Frisch. These false allegations, coupled with further insinuations that von Frisch had been involved in discussions about initiating a military revolt, were sufficient to force his resignation in February 1938, although he was later found to have been falsely accused in all respects. Nevertheless, Müller and the Gestapo had performed their task effectively enough that Hitler could now assert greater control over the Wehrmacht. With the appointment of the compliant Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel to oversee the army in the aftermath of the Blomberg-Fritsch affair, Hitler was able to establish firmer control over the German military. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair and the removal of more skeptical elements within the German army occurred at a time when the Nazis were accelerating their progression toward war. Ever since seizing power in 1933, the Nazis had become increasingly aggressive in their foreign policy. Almost immediately upon consolidating their power, they began incrementally rebuilding the German army and the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Then in March 1936, another crucial element of the peace accord was breached when the Rhineland was remilitarized. According to the terms of Versailles, this region, bordering France and the Low Countries, was supposed to remain largely devoid of any German military presence. Events escalated from that point. In March 1938, Austria was annexed, while just months later, in 1938, the Nazis also sought to annex the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia and were duly permitted to do so by the Allies, who at that stage believed they could still appease Hitler and the Nazis. Subsequently, in the early months of 1939, the remainder of Czechoslovakia and Hungary were transformed into puppet regimes. Eventually, on September 3, 1939, in response to Hitler and the Nazis' invasion of Poland 2 days prior, Britain and France finally declared war on Germany, marking the commencement of the Second World War. Müller played a central role in the outbreak of the war. In the summer of 1939, it was not yet certain that the invasion of Poland would definitively trigger war. Hitler and senior party members believed that if intervention in the country could be justified to the international media, perhaps Poland too could be occupied without instigating a wider conflict. This would afford the regime an even longer period to continue augmenting its military capabilities. Consequently, the decision was made to fabricate a justification for invading Poland. Responsibility for this task was assigned to Himmler, Heinrich, and Müller in what was termed Operation Himmler. This was to be a false flag operation designed to provide a pretext for a German invasion of Poland by staging several purported Polish attacks on German border stations and officials. For one such incident, Müller personally had several prisoners removed from Dachau concentration camp, dressed in Polish uniforms, and then executed. Their bodies were then placed at a German radio station in Gliwice on the Polish border, and a narrative was fabricated claiming that these individuals were Polish soldiers killed during an attack on the station. This false flag operation was executed on August 31st. Germany invaded Poland the following day. Müller's role in Operation Himmler proved to be a boon to his career advancement at a particularly opportune moment. With the outbreak of war, a decision was reached among senior Nazi leadership and the heads of various security forces to consolidate the Gestapo and other police organizations under a new overarching entity named the Reich Security Main Office. The rationale was that this would centralize security apparatuses throughout the expanding amount of German-controlled territory in Europe and enhance efficiency. Furthermore, Heinrich was now promoted from his position as head of the Gestapo to become head of the new Reich Security Main Office. Despite his questionable political past, Müller's contribution to creating the justification for war with Poland and Heinrich's patronage were sufficient to ensure his appointment as Heinrich's successor as head of the Gestapo. To facilitate his promotion, he also finally joined the Nazi Party in 1939, a belated action highlighting his peculiar situation, where someone who ascended to such high rank within the regime appeared to be a lukewarm supporter of the Nazi Party itself. In addition, Müller was elevated to the position of Oberführer, or senior leader, within the SS. His particular skill in this domain, honed since the 1920s, focused on identifying threats linked to the Soviet Union and communism within Germany more broadly. A notable instance of this was the identification of the Red Orchestra in 1941. This was a wide network of communist sympathizers based in Berlin and elsewhere who distributed leaflets and posters promoting socialist values and civil disobedience within Germany. This network included figures from within the officer corps of the Army and Air Force, as well as members of the German judiciary, such as Harro Schulze-Boysen and Arvid Harnack. While these individuals were not substantially connected to the Soviet regime in Russia, suspicions within the Gestapo were rife that they were planning something more sinister following the German invasion of Russia in 1941. Having discerned the scope of the group in 1941, they were placed under Müller's surveillance for months before widespread arrests commenced from autumn 1942 onward. By spring 1943, well over 100 individuals had been apprehended, and the orchestra was dismantled. In the early 1940s, the range of domains in which Müller operated expanded significantly beyond Germany, although police work within the home country consistently remained his primary responsibility. Following the outbreak of war in September 1939, Poland was conquered and occupied by Germany within a matter of weeks. Months of inactivity ensued throughout the winter and early spring of 1940, leading many to refer to a phony war in Europe. However, in late spring, a series of conquests were undertaken. Denmark and Norway were swiftly occupied by German forces from April 1940 followed in May by the conquest of the Low Countries in France in a whirlwind campaign that brought much of Western Europe under German dominion in just 6 weeks. Early 1941 then witnessed Hitler assisting his Italian ally, Benito Mussolini, in Italy's conquest of the Balkans, while the invasion of Russia from June 1941 onward brought a vast expanse of territory encompassing Ukraine, Belarus, and much of Western Russia under German occupation. As these rapid conquests unfolded, Müller found himself addressing a range of issues beyond Germany, particularly in the regions of Central Europe and Czechoslovakia and Western Poland that were being most closely integrated into the German Reich. Almost immediately after the war's commencement, Müller became increasingly involved in the regime's policy concerning the Jewish population within German-controlled territories. The Nazis were virulently anti-Semitic, and domestic persecution of Germany's Jewish community had been ongoing since the party's rise to power in 1933. Throughout the pre-war years, this primarily focused on politically disenfranchising German Jews through measures such as the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. These laws prohibited marriage between Jews and Germans and restricted the employment and economic opportunities of Germany's Jewish population. The laws also effectively stripped German Jews of their citizenship. A significant aim of these economic and political sanctions was to coerce the country's Jewish population into emigration, either to the Middle East, where Jewish communities were attempting to establish themselves in the Holy Land, or to countries like Britain and the US. This intensified in the months leading up to the war's outbreak, most notably during Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, when state-organized attacks across Germany led to the death or serious injury of hundreds of German Jews and attacks on thousands of Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues. Müller was heavily implicated in this episode, serving as the Gestapo official who oversaw the arrest of upwards of 30,000 German Jews in connection with Kristallnacht. However, as severe as this pre-war persecution was, Germany's Jewish community was relatively small. With the conquest of Eastern Europe in the early war years, where the majority of Europe's Jewish population resided during the early and mid-20th century, millions more Jewish people came under Nazi rule. Concurrently, the Nazi state's persecution became increasingly intense from 1939 onward. As early as January 1939, with the annexation of Austria and other Central European territories, the Reich's Central Office for Jewish Emigration was established in Berlin, with a subsidiary office already operational in Vienna since autumn 1938. Its objective was to extend the policy of forced migration of Jewish people, which had been in effect in Germany throughout the 1930s, to the newly acquired territories in Central Europe. Heinrich was appointed to oversee the Berlin office, and Adolf Eichmann was his counterpart in Vienna. The Central Office's operational scope would expand significantly in the years that followed, particularly into Poland. Müller would play a crucial role in the Central Office's functioning, initially as Heinrich's deputy and subsequently in his own capacity as head of the Gestapo. Initially, the escalating persecution of European Jews centered on intensified efforts to compel mass migration. Figures such as Himmler, Heinrich, and Müller largely supervised these endeavors. As early as October 1939, Müller was overseeing initiatives to relocate tens of thousands of Polish Jews into ghettos in cities like Warsaw. In this, he collaborated closely with Eichmann, the security service or SD official in Poland, tasked with overseeing policy concerning the Jewish population in the conquered country. Again, forced emigration remained the preferred tactic to reduce the Jewish population of Eastern Europe at this time. However, given the millions of Jews in Eastern Europe and the severe disruption of migration routes due to the war, Nazi policy began to coalesce in 1940 around an outlandish scheme championed by Eichmann. This plan proposed transporting Europe's Jews to the East African island of Madagascar, where a kind of vast open-air prison would be established. Nevertheless, this plan was abandoned during 1941 as it became apparent that Germany would be unable to seize the Suez Canal from Britain in North Africa, rendering such mass deportations of millions of European Jews impractical. Although the exact timing of his notification remains unclear, surviving statements indicate that Müller was among the first senior Nazi regime figures to learn during 1941 that a new and horrific approach to the Jewish question had been decided upon by Hitler and others such as Himmler and Goebbels. What has become known as the final solution, which led to the Holocaust, would involve the forcible deportation of European Jews to concentration camps situated throughout Eastern and Central Europe, primarily in Poland. There they would be murdered by the Nazi regime in massive numbers. As early as late summer and autumn 1941, experiments were conducted at concentration camps such as Auschwitz in western Poland, using gases like Zyklon B, which would be employed for executions. The bodies would then be incinerated in crematoria within the camps. Müller was also kept fully informed about the Einsatzgruppen, or death squads, deployed throughout Eastern Europe in 1941. Over the next 4 years, these squads would be responsible for the murder of over 1.3 million Jews, as well as hundreds of thousands of political prisoners. He was also a leading figure in organizing and overseeing these activities in the months and years that followed. On January 20th, 1942, Müller attended a conference at Wannsee, a suburb outside Berlin. This conference was organized by Heydrich and Eichmann, with Müller also playing a prominent role. During this conference, many high-ranking officials from the Nazi Party and the SS in charge of the concentration camp system were informed about the final solution, which had been developed and decided upon over the preceding 8 months. From this point onward, Müller played a very senior role in orchestrating the genocide of European Jews. Much of his work, as delegated by Himmler, focused on ensuring the concealment of evidence of the mass murder occurring. This involved burning the bodies of those killed in the camps, a task that became challenging in camps like Treblinka and Auschwitz-Birkenau, where crematoria often could not incinerate bodies quickly enough. Despite this challenge, he was commanded in 1943 to travel to Italy to compel Benito Mussolini's government to increase the numbers of Italian Jews being deported to camps in the north and northeast. Ultimately, Müller, alongside figures like Himmler, Heydrich, Eichmann, and Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, was largely responsible for overseeing the mass murder of European Jews between late 1941 and the war's end in summer 1945. While the final solution was ultimately decided upon by Hitler, Göring, Goebbels, Himmler, and others at the Nazi regime's highest echelons, its practical implementation on a daily basis was largely entrusted to administrators and bureaucrats like Müller, Höss, and Eichmann. The policy's outcome was catastrophic. During the 3-year period between the Wannsee Conference in January 1942 and the liberation of most concentration camps in the early weeks and months of 1945, approximately 6 million European Jews were murdered, either in camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Sobibor, and Treblinka, or through executions by the Einsatzgruppen. In late 1941, Heydrich had been appointed interim governor of the region. He quickly gained a reputation for brutally suppressing any form of political dissent and was soon identified by Britain and the Czechoslovakian resistance movement as an assassination target. Consequently, some months later, on May 27, 1942, in a mission codenamed Operation Anthropoid, Heydrich was attacked en route to his office near Prague by 2 resistance fighters, Józef Gabčík and Jan Kubis. Heydrich was severely injured in the attack and died from his wounds a week later, making him the only senior Nazi leader successfully assassinated during World War II. Müller was promptly sent to Prague to investigate, Gabčík and Kubis having escaped after wounding Heydrich. In an exceptionally vicious crackdown in the weeks that followed, Müller not only tracked down and killed the 2 assassins and the resistance fighters who had sheltered them, but also carried out reprisals across Czechoslovakia, resulting in approximately 5,000 deaths, over 13,000 imprisonments, and the effective destruction of the entire villages of Lidice and Ležáky. Heydrich's assassination also altered Müller's position within the security forces. In January 1943, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was appointed as the new head of the Reich Security Main Office, succeeding Heydrich. Kaltenbrunner became Müller's direct superior, but Müller evidently exercised greater autonomy under Kaltenbrunner than he had during Heydrich's tenure. As a result of these developments, Müller now became arguably the second most senior individual in implementing the final solution. As head of the SS, which had overall control of concentration camps throughout Europe, Himmler was at the apex of those overseeing the Holocaust. However, Müller's role in providing intelligence on the locations and movements of European Jews arguably placed him second only to Himmler in this respect, and senior to figures like Eichmann, who managed the logistics of transporting European Jews to death camps, and figures like Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, or Franz Stangl, the commandant of Sobibor and then Treblinka. Consequently, Müller's career as head of the Gestapo in the 1940s is inseparable from his role in the Holocaust. Much of Müller's work between 1943 and 1945 would focus on rooting out conspiracies against the Nazi state. Plans to overthrow Hitler and his accomplices, both from within the military and elements of civil society, proliferated during these years, largely because the war effort had soured, diminishing the prospect of German victory. After the initial rapid conquest of Ukraine, Belarus, and much of Western Russia in late summer and autumn 1941, German armies stalled outside St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Stalingrad in the winter of 1941 and were decimated in the following weeks, lacking adequate protective clothing for the brutal Russian winter. Efforts in 1942 centered on capturing Stalingrad, but when this failed in the autumn and winter of that year, the tide inexorably turned on the Eastern Front, and the Russians began pushing the Germans back into Ukraine and Belarus in 1943. Elsewhere, Italians and Germans were expelled from North Africa in early 1943, and a southern front opened in Italy that summer. Finally, a western front was opened by the US, Britain, and the Western Allies in France in the summer of 1944. It was now only a matter of when, not if, the Nazis would be defeated. As this reality dawned in Germany, many groups began plotting ways to overthrow Hitler and the Nazis, and attempt to negotiate an end to the war with the Allies. Müller soon found himself addressing many of these conspiracies, as well as unrest concerning his role as head of the Gestapo. One such episode involved dismantling the Solf Circle, a group of German intellectuals and academics formed around Hanna Solf, widow of Dr. Wilhelm Solf, a prominent German politician and diplomat during the Second German Reich who had openly opposed the Nazis in the years before his death in 1936. In the initial years of the 1940s, even amidst the ongoing war, Hanna Solf convened gatherings for individuals opposing Hitler and the Nazi regime within her Berlin salon. Although they were not devising any armed insurrection, the Circle's associates had proactively endeavored to shield German Jews and facilitate their escape from Germany as the Holocaust commenced. On September 10, 1943, a Gestapo operative infiltrated a tea gathering hosted by the Circle, which subsequently led to the arrest of the majority of its senior members. Several were dispatched to concentration camps, while others endured torture at the hands of Müller's Gestapo and even faced execution. Subsequently, throughout 1943 and the early part of 1944, Müller also directed Gestapo agents to apprehend thousands of German students engaged in protest factions, such as the White Rose Student Collective and the Swing Youth. Again, despite these groups largely participating in nonviolent demonstrations, hundreds were subjected to torment or even met their demise. As critical as numerous of these security concerns were for Müller, none posed quite as substantial a threat to the Nazis' dominion as one that the Gestapo head was tasked with investigating during the summer of 1944. What has since become recognized as the 20 July plot was a scheme orchestrated by numerous high-ranking figures within the German military, with the objective of assassinating Hitler alongside several other senior members of the regime and subsequently seizing control. It was anticipated that a new military administration could then secure favorable surrender terms from the Allied forces as swiftly as possible. The conspiracy, spearheaded by German officer Lieutenant Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and others such as General Friedrich Olbricht, became known as Operation Valkyrie. On July 20, 1944, Stauffenberg attended a conference at Hitler's Wolf's Lair, situated near Rastenburg in eastern Prussia. Upon entering, he positioned a briefcase packed with explosives beneath the conference table. He subsequently departed to answer a prearranged telephone call, and it was during his absence that the bomb detonated. However, while the explosion resulted in one fatality and injured numerous individuals in the room, it failed to kill Hitler, potentially because the briefcase was relocated after von Stauffenberg had left the chamber. Consequently, the 20 July plot was destined for failure before it genuinely commenced. After departing the meeting at the Wolf's Lair, von Stauffenberg promptly returned to Berlin. Plans for a broader seizure of power in Berlin by the conspirators then initiated, but with Hitler and the senior commanders having survived and the plot being rapidly exposed, it all proved futile. By the conclusion of the day, the schemes to occupy key edifices in Berlin by Olbricht and von Stauffenberg had collapsed. Both von Stauffenberg, Olbricht, and several other leading rebels were apprehended and executed at approximately 1 a.m. that night. Müller, in his capacity as a senior Gestapo official, now became central in investigating the full extent of the conspiracy. In the ensuing days and weeks, anyone even remotely suspected of having an association with the plotters was arrested, ultimately totaling over 5,000 individuals. A considerable proportion of these appear to have possessed minimal or no knowledge of the plot. Such was the rigor with which Müller pursued the investigation that individuals unable to definitively prove their innocence were nonetheless persecuted. Indeed, over 200 of the principal plotters were executed, while Judge Roland Freisler, the presiding judge of the German People's Court, delivered sentences upon those implicated. It was ultimately Müller who determined who would face this sham court in the late summer and autumn of 1944. Müller was also exhibiting increasing fanaticism during the war's concluding stages. By the winter of 1944, it was evident to everyone that Germany was facing defeat. Russian forces were advancing rapidly through Poland and were poised to cross the River Oder into the German heartland in early 1945. More significantly, the Western Allies were swiftly liberating Western Europe following the D-Day landings in the summer of 1944. Paris had been retaken in a brief campaign during mid to late August, followed by a further eastward advance that liberated Brussels and the majority of Belgium in September. The path was now open for an incursion into Germany and the Rhineland during the winter of 1944. Germany's sole realistic hope now lay in the possibility of a critical rift developing between the Western Allies and Stalin and the Russians before Berlin's capture. Accordingly, the German military command was stalling for time and launched a counter-offensive in the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg in December 1944. While initially quite successful, this was at best a delaying tactic intended to potentially secure more favorable peace terms. However, Müller appears to have genuinely believed that the war's momentum was shifting once more. In the final days of 1944, he is documented as informing one of his officers within the Gestapo offices in Berlin that the Ardennes offensive would soon drive the Western Allies back into France and that Nazi flags would once again fly over Paris in 1945. This was pure delusion. In the war's final months, Müller, who had spent much of the conflict in Berlin, was joined in the capital by a growing contingent of senior Nazi officials who had been stationed elsewhere in occupied Europe for several years. He occupied himself attempting to leverage his network of double agents to sow discord among the Allied leaders. Rumors surfaced during this period that the Gestapo head had initiated secret negotiations with the Soviet secret services. But this is improbable. One of Müller's few genuine political convictions was his abhorrence of the Soviet regime, and the rumors appear to have been entirely fabricated by Walter Schellenberg, a rival for power within the Reich security main office. The subsequent day marked the conclusion of the Battle of Berlin when General Helmuth Weidling surrendered to the Russians. Following Germany's surrender and the declaration of the war's end on May 8, 1945, the laborious process of identifying, arresting, and prosecuting the leading members of the Nazi regime and those culpable of war crimes was initiated by the Allies. Given its central role in the Holocaust, the maintenance of the totalitarian state, and the torture and execution of thousands of political prisoners over the years, members of the Gestapo were at the forefront of those prosecuted by the Allies. The Gestapo itself had ceased to exist with the Nazi regime's demise, and had been designated a criminal organization by the Allies. When an international military tribunal was established by the Allies in November 1945, it identified three primary groups within Germany as needing to be held accountable for their wartime conduct: the senior leadership of the Nazi Party, the SS, and the Gestapo. Individuals tried in the Nuremberg trials who had been members of the Gestapo included Göring, Kaltenbrunner, and the Austrian Nazi leader Arthur Seyss-Inquart. However, Müller would never face trial or conviction, as in May 1945, as the war was entering its final days and hours, the Gestapo chief had simply disappeared. Müller was last observed on the evening of May 1, 1945. It was on this evening that Hitler's designated successor, Joseph Goebbels, committed suicide, leaving the Nazi regime without a leader. Müller had been overheard stating around this time that he had no intention of being captured alive by the Russians. As the head of an agency that had persecuted Russian sympathizers and Russian prisoners of war, Müller had more cause than most to fear his potential fate. Thus, he vanished around the time of Goebbels' suicide, although unsubstantiated claims place him with Himmler near the Danish border on May 11th, shortly before the SS chief's capture, just over a week later. No trace of his whereabouts was detected by the Allies in the weeks that followed. But Müller had been classified by the Allies as a person of major interest and someone who would be tried at Nuremberg for his actions if apprehended. Accordingly, on May 27, 1945, the Counterintelligence War Room listed him among his priority targets who remained at large. Despite focused investigations in the ensuing weeks and months, Müller remained missing. His disappearance rendered him the most senior figure in the Nazi regime whose location could not be ascertained. Müller was never located, but the sudden nature of his vanishing has generated numerous theories regarding his fate ever since. One of the most prevalent theories, largely fueled by Schellenberg's earlier assertions of Müller's involvement in negotiations with the Soviets towards the war's end, posited that he was captured by the Russians shortly after Berlin's fall and taken into secret protective custody in the war's aftermath. This theory was further supported by unsubstantiated claims that Müller had been sighted in Moscow and elsewhere in the years following the war. Another theory, gaining renewed traction in the early 1960s following Adolf Eichmann's capture in Argentina, suggested that Müller, like many other Nazis, had fled to South America after the war. Nazi war criminals had been afforded protection there by Juan Perón's administration in the war's wake. Consequently, this renewed speculation prompted investigations throughout Latin America in the 1960s to locate Müller, ultimately leading to the identification of a suspect, Francis Keith Willard, residing in Panama City, who was briefly believed to be Müller. Fingerprint analysis eventually revealed that this theory was unfounded, and no evidence to this day suggests that Müller ended up in Latin America post-war. Numerous investigations were subsequently undertaken to both locate Müller and ascertain precisely what had transpired in 1945. An independent report produced by a committee of historians and other figures at the time concluded that, while they could not definitively state Müller's fate, it seemed probable that the U.S. government had not sheltered him, a theory that Russian counterintelligence agencies had attempted to propagate during the Cold War. This claim was further substantiated by newly discovered documents indicating that the supposed location of Müller's body was indeed identified by Allied investigators at the time. Tuchel further asserted that Müller had been documented as still wearing his police uniform and that his ID was found on his person. Corroborating Tuchel's claims has proven impossible, as Jewish religious laws prohibit the exhumation of bodies. However, if true, this would strongly suggest that the Gestapo chief throughout World War II was killed or committed suicide shortly after his last sighting in Hitler's bunker on May 1, 1945. The truth, however, remains that with the passage of over 75 years and numerous investigations, we will almost certainly never definitively know what happened to Müller. Whether he perished in 1945, was taken into Russian custody, fled to South America, or ended up elsewhere. His fate remains one of the great unresolved mysteries of the Second World War. Of all the leading figures within the Nazi regime in the Third Reich, Heinrich Müller was undoubtedly one of the most despicable. He seemed to possess no interest or personality beyond the meticulous investigative and bureaucratic tasks he undertook ceaselessly from his Gestapo induction in 1934 until the war's end 11 years later. Politically, however, he was something of an enigma. Earlier in his career, he had been involved in investigating Hitler and the nascent Nazi Party in Bavaria following the failed Munich Putsch in November 1923. Furthermore, he was affiliated with the Bavarian People's Party in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and even advised the regional government in Munich to resist the Nazis during their power grab in 1933. Ultimately, his survival and advancement within the Gestapo were solely due to Heydrich's personal patronage, and he resisted joining the Nazi Party himself until 1939, when it became a prerequisite for succeeding Heydrich as Gestapo chief. Thus, we are left with a tepid Nazi, one who appears to have been more politically adaptable if it served his career ambitions. Yet whatever Müller's personal political inclinations, they had minimal impact on mitigating the violence of his actions. Müller was among the Nazi Germany figures most responsible for the persecution and bloodshed unleashed between 1939 and 1945. As Gestapo head, he systematically eradicated any perceived regime opponents, be they left-leaning communist sympathizers or anti-war student protesters. Countless individuals suffered arrest, torture, imprisonment, or even death, sometimes for relatively minor infractions. The brutal manner in which Müller oversaw the reprisals in Czechoslovakia following Heydrich's assassination in 1942 is indicative of Müller's methods. However, it is ultimately his role in the Holocaust with which Müller will be permanently associated. From as early as Kristallnacht in 1938, Müller was playing a significant role in the persecution of European Jews, which expanded considerably in subsequent years. His centrality to the ensuing Holocaust is evidenced both by his being among the first senior German officials informed of the final solution in 1941 and his pivotal role in the Wannsee Conference of January 1942. Ultimately, the mysterious circumstances of his disappearance in 1945 are somewhat regrettable, as they ensured Müller would never be tried for his crimes at Nuremberg. What are your reflections on Heinrich Müller? How significant a figure do you consider him to have been in orchestrating the Holocaust, and what do you believe became of him following his disappearance in 1945? Please share your thoughts in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.